Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. If you are so inclined, use the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from and what you're going to be drinking. I'm in Seattle. Actually, we're all in Seattle except for Elizabeth. Anyone going to share? Hello, hello, hello. West Seattle waiting to open the wines. Okay. You can probably go ahead and open them. That's okay. All right, we're going to let a few more people tune in and then we will get started. Hello from Olympia. Hi, Tina. And Jill in Bellevue, welcome. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. I know more people will join us as we get going. All right, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle in the Fremont neighborhood. It's called Book Larder. And in more normal times, we do a lot of cooking classes and author talks actually in the store because we have a kitchen in the space. And lately we have taken our events onto Zoom. And so I'm really excited to do this event today with Raven and Russ Morgan from Phenol55 and Brad Goldberg, who is sort of a Phenol and Book Larder connector. And of course, with Elizabeth Schneider, who is the author of this wonderful book, Wine for Normal People. We are going to obviously do some tasting today, and we've not tried this before at Book Larder. Elizabeth has led lots of these, so I am excited to learn from her and share in her expertise. I hope that lots of you have got your wines and are going to join us in that. We're going to spend some time talking about the book, talking about Elizabeth's career. And in just a second, Raven and Russ will join us to just let you know a little bit about what Phenol55 is all about. We are going to use the chat feature throughout the event. So if you haven't used it much before, it's there is a little drop down that by default says all panelists. If you just want the panelists to see what you're saying, that's fine. But if you want other people to say it, then you need to choose all panelists and attendees. And so you can use that space to talk to each other. When we do the tasting, you can use it to kind of put in comments about what you're tasting and what you're experiencing. And if you have questions for Elizabeth or anyone else, you can put those in the chat as well. And I will also drop a link into the chat so that if you would like to order a copy of the book from Book Larder, you can do that. All right, so I'm going to ask Elizabeth and Raven to join us now. And Raven is going to just tell us a little bit about Phenol55. Hello,
Yeah.
Raven and Russ. Hi. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi. Hi. My husband, Russ, and I own Phenol55, which is a tech-driven storage facility down in Georgetown. We catalog everybody's wine. We photograph and research and input, and we store people's wine. And so hopefully you guys get a lot out of this. And thank you for joining.
And thank you for doing this with us. It's a lot of fun. And Raven and Russ and Brad are going to tune back in just a little bit to be sort of the screen guinea pigs for the tasting. So they'll be doing on screen what you guys are all doing at home. So thank you. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm
Hello,
so excited
everybody.
we got to do this.
This is so fun. This is the beauty of the virtual world, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you're in North Carolina and I'm
Yep.
here in Seattle, and hey, we can still do this. So thank you for being here. And congratulations on your wonderful book. I've been a fan for a while, so I'm really delighted that we get to talk about this.
Thank you. It
Yeah.
took many years to finish.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Well, and it seems like it's sort of the output of your own sort of personal journey and career. So tell us a little bit about sort of your background and how you got interested in wine.
Yeah.
I don't come from a wine background. I was not born. I always love to hear these stories of people being like, well, when I was younger, my grandparents drank blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, my grandmother drank Kahlua. Like that was our big thing. Manischewitz,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
on the holidays. But we didn't have that. We weren't, we didn't have money, and my parents were first generation to go to college and all that kind of stuff. So my dad was a professor, and so he was around some stuff with wine. I grew up on Long Island, and then he started to get kind of snotty about wine when I was in college. And I wound up after college moving to Boston, living with my sister. And we would just sort of look at each other and be like, Dad is so snotty about wine. We have to learn something. We got to learn something. So we would go into wine shops. This is what people do. And it was so degrading. It was the worst experience ever. First of all, you go to the wall of wine, all the bottles look the same. You don't know what you're doing. Is it is that a variety? Is that a place? You got to figure, I don't know, who knows, right? I don't know. And there's nothing to tell you, and there's nobody to tell you, and you have no idea if somebody says something's good, you don't know if you should actually believe them. There was a lot of all of that going on. So I continued to do that, but I couldn't figure out how to get into the wine industry. So I was working in tech. And then when I was applying to business school, I took a class. I should say, at the Boston Center for Adult Education, learned from this guy how the wine world worked, about varietals, about all these random, and I had this, I will never forget, I had Trimbach Riesling from Alsace, France. And it was like, whoa, that's different. That's something I need to have more of. That's wine. That's not the Pinot Grigio and oaky Chardonnay that I've had. So then, I was even more excited to do wine, and then wound up getting into the wine industry after I went to business school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and found, again, even at a large winery in California, people were still snotty about wine. And the willingness to help normal people who like wine but are not, that's not their job, was just astounding to me, that nobody wanted to help. So I finally left that company, and that's when I started a blog, because it was in 2009 and everyone started a blog. And then I started the podcast in 2011, which, then somebody besides my mother started to listen to it. And by the end of that year, we won iTunes Best New Arts Podcast, and I was on the way.
Oh, it's excellent. Well, and it's interesting that you say, that it can be intimidating when you're just getting started with wine, because I find, as somebody, I've been drinking and learning about wine for, I don't know, 20 years or so. And I still find that, like, if I have a question about something, or I exhibit any kind of, like, I may not know 150% of what I'm talking about in certain situations, it's really intimidating. It's that, like, you still get that reaction from people. Yep. So tell me more about sort of, how you gear your work towards both new drinkers and sort of more experienced drinkers.
Yeah, I the way that I look at wine is that it's like any other hobby. So I hate hearing that you still feel that way, but I understand it, because
Once in a
even when
while.
I'm around, I do this for a living. And even when I'm around other wine people, sometimes I'm like, I don't want to say anything, because they are so, it is the people that sell and drink wine in that inner circle of people that I think really mess it up for the rest of us, honestly. So my idea, or my job, my concept, my whatever, the whole book, my whole business, is to figure out how to teach smart people about wine. So I already know I'm not looking for wine for dummies. I am not looking for drink what you like. I, in fact, discourage people from doing that, because then you don't have to try around, right? I encourage critical thinking. I encourage you to ask questions and not be afraid to ask questions. And assuming that you are a smart person who can get things, which that's who my audience is, and that's hopefully who's listening to this. If you are that kind of person who likes to learn, who likes to read, who's curious, who likes to travel, then that's where I can meet you. I can meet you anywhere on the road because you have the capacity and the willingness to learn. It's not, and so I'm not going to ever teach you something and make you feel like an idiot because you don't know it. You're just at that point in your journey. You could also be really far down your journey. Let me tell you, there's plenty of people I've done tastings for, I've done cellar organization for, I have, spoken to at parties or at industry events, people who you would think know everything. They have huge cellars of Napa wine. They don't know anything about wine besides Napa wine. And so that's not knowing about wine. So, there's a lot of emperor has no clothes here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's also a lot of wine books out in the world. So what made you decide to write a book, and what did you want to accomplish with your book?
As I was looking at the landscape of books, I was 2011 was a great year. I had a baby. I had the podcast, the podcast started that I had that baby. And I won iTunes Best New Arts podcast. And I was approached by a literary agent, which, being in the book world, that's unusual, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You have right. Usually she was listening to the podcast. She said, "You have a very unique voice. I would like you to write a book." So that was amazing. And it took me a while to figure out I don't know anything about books. So I was like, what do you want from me? But anyway, it took 6 years to write this book, but my thought was, now I had kids in between this, which anybody that has kids understands it's a lot of work, but the idea was, how do I take this concept of treating people like they're regular people and taking the subject and basically having a conversation with their reader, not making it like, here is what I have to say about wine, and here is the proclamation. And I mean, in this bookshelf, I have plenty of books where they say that. And I think I question things. I make analogies to things that I think people relate to. I try to simplify things. Like one of my favorite sections, my dad actually came up with it. I can't really take credit for it, but I was able to finesse this because this is such a great analogy. In the Burgundy section of the book, I talk about the classification levels of Burgundy and compare them to Toyotas, right? Car models.
Yeah.
The baseline, like you have the Camry, and then you have like the LE, and then you have the XLE or whatever it is, and then you have like the fully loaded thing, right? And so that just takes it to something that people know, right? You feel a level of comfort. So that's the kinds of things that I try to do. And I did not see a book out there that was like that. Everyone, and I'm not, I don't want to like say anything bad, but everybody was using the Wine Bible. The Wine Bible is great, but it's not a book you can read through, and it doesn't work on multiple levels. You really have to know something about wine. And a lot of people were using that book, and I found that, there was kind of this hole of people, like not being able to access wine in that way. And I have been very fortunate because universities are now using my book as their textbook for hospitality and things like that, because kids who are getting into wine relate to this. And that's awesome too.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what I would say. I mean, the thing that struck me about it when it came out was the normal people part is more about the voice than it is about, sort of starting. Well, you do sort of start with introductory, but it's a great reference and a great resource, I think, no matter where you are experience wise. Like I was looking through, the geography part and thinking like, oh yeah, I need to bone up on some of these regions that I haven't been drinking from, and that sort of thing. So I think it does an amazing job with that.
Thank you. I think with everything I do, I try to go shallow and deep at the same time. So depending on where you are, if all you can absorb is like right here, that's awesome. But if you're beyond that, then, we can get into soil types, and I'll start to talk about, pruning techniques and things like that. We can go there. But and I can have that all in the same conversation. And I think that even the people who are at the beginning of their wine journey are okay with it, because I try to just mention it. And
Yeah.
if you pick it, if you grab it, you'll see it. But I mean, I think again, there's some sections in the book that go quite deep into this stuff. Like the regional stuff can go very deep, but you almost don't notice it. That was kind of my goal. That's
Yeah.
kind of why it took a long time to write, because I was always trying to get the voice, make sure that my voice was coming through, because it's a lot of like really geeky research information too in there,
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's a hard balance to strike, and you've done it really well. So
Thank you.
I also wanted to, before we start tasting, let's talk about your podcast a little bit. You were sort of podcasting before it was really cool. So what made you decide to do it? And how has it sort of informed your work?
Sorry, I just moved my microphone. So if I sound louder, it's for that reason. So everything always happens in these weird ways. I had just left the large winery. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I had a friend who was like, he had an app, a wine app, also very popular in 2009, blogs and wine apps, right? Everybody had to have one. And he asked me if I would write content for the wine app. And clearly I needed work. So I was like, oh, absolutely. And I did that for him. And then the following January, or maybe that fall, I went and visited, I went out to California where he was, and we had dinner, and I was like, I just want to do something like a TV show or something that's, he's like, why don't you start a podcast? I was like, what the hell is that? This was in 2010. Yeah, it was actually that fall. He's like, well, it's kind of like a radio show. They're going to be really big. And I was like, okay. He's like, I'll do it with you because it'll be great for my app. So in, I guess December, we started recording, and then again, it just sort of kept going, and he was really busy and he couldn't really keep up with the recording schedule, but this was something I wanted to do. I was really enjoying it. I have like a bit of it like theater background and all that kind of stuff. So I really liked it. And then I dragged my husband into it. I was like, you have a good voice. You're going to do this with me. And then we just started, and then it was like, it just snowballed. And yeah, it's been a great ride. I mean, it really took off after Serial, that NPR, right? So after that, it really took off. But I mean, 10 years now, it's fantastic. And I've been very fortunate because, again, I'm kind of uncompromising on the content. Some people don't like the style, but it's a very accurate information. And so the audience is really normal people. It's not really that many, some industry people, but really like normal people. And I've managed to hang on to a lot of the early listeners, which is just amazing. I've never done advertising for the podcast. I've always sort of had this philosophy that, indie growth, like that independent grassroots growth of people finding the podcast, liking it. And so I'm still always surprised if people like know about it, and that I was in the New York Times, like the podcast was featured in the New York Times. I was like, Jesus, like what, really? And Wine Enthusiast and Forbes. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's kind of like, it's this weird thing. Like there's a picture of Oprah back there. The book was in Oprah. Like it's just this kind of thing. But I never, I think the podcast is just like, it's this entity unto itself now.
Yeah. Well, and I think the fact that you've been able to talk about wine for 10 years like shows that it's not like a finite closed subject, right? And so just one more question before we move to the tasting, what would you say have been like some of the biggest industry changes you've observed sort of through that lens of the podcast, either in what people drink or how things are grown, or like, what are some of those things?
I think that a couple things. First of all, some regions that were not very prominent nor very good have definitely come up out of nothing. Finger Lakes really comes to mind. They were good, but they weren't as good as they are right now. I would say even Walla Walla definitely has had, incremental leaps in quality. And I would also say that what's really interesting is that the New World, meaning everywhere that's not Europe, has started to merge like a lot of techniques with Old World, so that those lines are blurring a lot. And The old world, unfortunately or fortunately, is heated up. And so we see some wines that really look more like New World wines. So there is some merging, but on the other hand, there's a lot of countries right now that are awesome because they are just like, we are going to fly the flag for our own grapes. And I don't care if you can't pronounce them. Here's Touriga Nacional. We're Portugal. That's it. That's our grape. Sorry you don't like it. Pronounce it. Pronounce it however you want it. Just drink it. You know, like I just released a podcast on Croatia. Maybe you can't, maybe you don't know what Plavac Mali is, or that it was pronounced Plavac Mali, but you know what? It's out there, it's on shelves, and we can drink it. So we have never been luckier. There's never been a better time for normal wine drinkers than right now, because the best wines, I mean, even better than some high-end wines, are between, you know, $18 to $30 right now. Even 15. And honestly, when in the case of Portugal, $8 will get you something pretty good. So yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, just the fact that you can get bottles that aren't made by like conglomerates with lots of crap in them, basically at that price range, is pretty great. So yeah.
Yes, you do have to watch out for those conglomerates with lots of crap in them. And if anybody is interested in what that crap is, you can go on my YouTube channel. I just did a winemaker series with this guy, Randy Meyer, who worked for Corbel for 20 years. And he and I we went full throttle. I also worked for a very large winery and saw some very disgusting things. So if you really want to know what's in industrial wine, watch that and you'll never buy it again.
All right. My college age self probably doesn't want to watch that podcast or watch that YouTube. So should we start tasting? Does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah,
Brad
absolutely.
and Raven and Russ, do you want to join us again? Hello.
All right. So
Hi there.
Dan had a question here. Virginia, I have friends that dish every Washington red for, I think VA is Virginia. Is that correct, Dan? I think that's what you're saying. Of course they are, oh no, you're talking about VA, you're talking about volatile acidity, or Virginia. I'm not sure. Volatile acidity. Yeah. I have friends that dish every what, you know, that's right. Well, let's just say that your Napa winemakers are using things like Velcorin to get rid of that. They are using additives, and volatile acidity, you know, that is something everybody is going to say that there's chemical issues with a wine they don't like. Okay, that's what I have found. So they will say there's too much Brettanomyces in it if they don't like it and they think it's too earthy. They will criticize wines that exhibit any sort of terroir, especially a lot of Napa wineries do this. They will just criticize, but the amount of chemicals that again, I would encourage you to watch this, but you had an entire conversation about Velcorin, which is poisonous to human health, and comes in a big, like with the cross and skull, you know, the skull and crossbones on it. And you know, but they put it in wine to increase the mouthfeel, to make it seem older. You know, so they can criticize Washington wines for volatile acidity, but there is, you know, there's some winemakers that don't do a good job, but I've never heard that as being like an overall blanket statement, and it's really kind of crazy. All right, so, and you should not be nervous about volatile acidity. Again, you know, these are things that people like to bring up, right? They like to bring up because they like to say, well, our wines are clean. Well, how did you get your clean wines? You added a lot of chemicals to do that. All right, let's talk about Syrah. I'm going to give you a little background on Syrah because I think it's always important to know what you're drinking. And then, of course, as I'm talking, please feel free to do the, you know, chat or, you know, whatever. But Syrah is a really interesting grape. It happens to be my favorite red grape. And part of it is that it is very mysterious. So that the origins of Syrah are always contested. Some people say, oh, it's from the city of Shiraz in Iran. Definitely not true. Is it from Greece? Is it from Sicily? No, likely it is from the Rhone Valley. It's sitting right where it has always been. It's a cross between Mondus Blanche, which is a white grape, and another grape called Duresa. And it is related to another grape called Mondus Noir, which if you ever get your hands on it, from Savoie, which is a mountainous French region, lots of alpine skiing there is really fantastic. And Viognier, the very, very floral grape, which is also native to the Rhone Valley. Now, if we think about Australia, Australia got this grape in the 1800s. It adapted to the dry climate. However, when we think about where Syrah grows best, and we can think about, as we're saying this, the places where you might enjoy Syrah from, it's generally places that are continental. So places like the Northern Rhone, where it is very warm during the day. However, it is very cool at night. It is a shorter growing season, and we are going to have an opportunity for full ripening. Syrah needs full ripeness. But if it's too hot, and anybody that's had like a really nasty Syrah knows this, it gets jammy and it loses its acidity, and it really is not a very pleasant drink. But if you grow it in cooler or marginal climates, these continental climates with very cool nights where, yeah, you know what? It's gonna, your frost is gonna be an issue on either end. It's late ripening, so frost actually usually isn't a problem in the springtime, but in the fall it could be. You are going to get something very delicious. Now, the other problem for Syrah, and why I think traditionally it's been an issue for people to really get their arms around, is because it, in the New World, everywhere that's not Europe, it has been planted based on climate. And the climate that they think Syrah needs is something very warm, which is not the case. Whereas in the old world, it really is planted basically on two things: soil types, and then we're talking about slopes. Because the thing for Syrah is that if you are going to ripen this grape, which is, it can go huge, right? You can have enormous yields, but if you can control them, if you can grow them on less fertile soil, then it will be really, really terroir driven. So the steepness of the slopes in the Rhone Valley, it's going to be the reflection of the river, adding light for photosynthesis, heating up the area a little bit so it doesn't get too cold. That's all going to matter. And those steep slopes are hugely important, especially in the Rhone Valley. So if you can get it to fully express itself, you're going to have a wine that's, it can range in color. Generally, it's pretty dark. You can see that if you've poured your wine already. And it's going to have, in some places, fruit, dark raspberries, blackberries, all of that, plums, and if it's really overripe, stewed fruit. And then in other incarnations, you will get minerality, right? Like a waterfall, or you'll get potting soil, or you'll get bacon fat, very common, olives, olive tapenade, lavender. These are all things that are quite possible. Pepper, black pepper, very, very prevalent, especially in the Rhone. All of these come from not growing it in a climate that's too hot, right? So that is important, and it will have tannin, and it should have acidity. Syrah is one of the four most tannic grapes in the world, with Cabernet Sauvignon, Tannat, and Nebbiolo. So it should have good tannin, and if it doesn't, something went horribly wrong. That's another, sort of hallmark of it. And when it is made, they sometimes co-ferment it with Viognier, as in the case of Côte Rôtie, sometimes in Australia. And the reason that they do that is because, of course, this is a native grape, and it used to be a field blend, right? They used to grow this stuff all together. But Viognier actually not only adds some sort of peachy characteristic, floral characteristic to the Syrah, it actually helps it retain color, which seems weird. It seems like if you added a white grapes that it wouldn't do that. But Viognier stabilizes color and then adds this floral, wonderful perfume and smooths out the tannin slightly, in which in bad years, you definitely are going to want that. So it's a real benefit. And if the wine is not tannic enough, sometimes they ferment it with the stems. So the styles are going to range, as we're going to see. You're going to get some that are very creamy. You will have some that are very tannic. And that's the beauty of Syrah, but it should be recognizable. And the issue again with Syrah is this climate and growing it in places that are too hot. So in France, they're doing 100% Syrah dominant wines. In the Southern Rhone, they're doing blends with Grenache and Mourvedre. Syrah is actually falling out of favor in the Southern Rhone. It's getting too hot for it. So they've already recognized this. I wish that some people in certain parts of California would also recognize that Syrah is not a hot weather grape, but that's a story for another time. In Washington, we have wines that are really dense and flavorful, and they've got a lot of blue and black fruit to them, and they do have that bacon fat and olive note to them if they are made really well. I mean, all you have to do is really go to Walla Walla and you'll see this. So let's talk about the Crozes Hermitage first. And so if you have that wine, just, you know, let's take a look at it. And, you know, this is in southeastern France. We're at the 45th parallel. We are in the Northern Rhone. This is this area that is around the Rhone Valley. Around the hill of Hermitage. Some areas for Crozes Hermitage, it's the largest area in the Northern Rhone. So you're going to have a lot of mixed flavors, or mixed, you know, if it grows on the flats, it won't be as fine as if it grows on the hills. But the continental climate is going to be ideal for Syrah. The terroir is going to be, you know, the soil types, the slopes, if it's on the slopes, are going to be ideal. Crozes Hermitage is 92% red. They're actually allowed to have, in terms of what's planted here, they're actually allowed to have Marsanne and Roussanne white grapes in the blend, but most of it is 100% Syrah. So 2,550 acres, largest production in the Rhone. That's kind of crazy, right? Not much grape acreage when you consider that that is the largest area. So it's on the left bank of the Rhone. So let's take a look at it. It should be dark in color, but not really inky. That's usually a sign. When you swirl it around the glass, look at the legs or the tiers, and that's going to indicate the alcohol level of a wine, because there's this thing called the Marangoti effect, which is the surface tension difference between water and alcohol and unfermented sugars. Water is going to drip down the glass first, then what's left on the sides of the glass is alcohol. So if you have a high alcohol wine, it's going to have these really long, drippy, gloppy tiers or legs. So you can play the game of guess that alcohol after you get good at that. But give it a swirl and take little tiny sniffs, the doggy sniffs, as I say in the book. And you should get a lot out of the glass, but not necessarily fruit. And if you're not used to drinking old world wines, it can be a little bit strange, but you may get black pepper. You may get some earthy notes. Mine definitely has that to it. It smells like minerals. It's, you know, really like a lot of, there's a sort of a hint of that olive in there, the olive tapenade. So take another sniff and then sip it and hold it in your mouth for a second and swallow. Always has a really good tannin, right? Brad, Raven, Russ, want to weigh in for the group? No?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on the tannin. I'm getting a lot of like, I don't know. I don't want to go steer into that geeky, fresh cut garden hose wine talk territory.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, I mean, clay.
Katie says it's earthy, and I totally agree with that, right? So that's usually what you're going to find, that earthy, you know, kind of, and when we are talking about it, like if you want to contribute to the comments, I think that the thing that we're not trying to write a wine note, right? Like that's not the goal here. The goal is to find categories that we can relate to. And the way to do that is to smell a lot of things. It's spring right now, right? So get out there and smell things. If you're gardening, smell underneath the shrubs and all that kind of stuff, smell the dirt, but also to get like, okay, does that smell like earth, or does it smell like a waterfall? Does it smell like rocks? What does that smell like? And then also getting the textures right is super important. So is it tannic and mouth drying? Is it acidic? Is underneath your tongue watering and watering and watering? I think that's definitely one of these things. Why is that important? Because this is like, if you were out there playing golf, and I don't play golf, so I'm going to say like a lot of stupid things about golf. I should ask my husband because he does play golf. Like if you were holding your putter, is that a thing? Iron thing, whatever it is, you were holding, like, you would have to learn. Somebody help me out here, please, Brad, help.
Your putter.
Okay, so like you would need to know what that did, right? Like you would need to know all of that, because if you don't know what that is, then you can't talk to the golf pro about your swing. And it's like that with wine. So you're learning this stuff so that then you can go and talk the language, right, inside that wine shop. So when Lara goes into the wine shop, she's not like, oh my God, I don't want to ask this question because I feel like a moron. She can say, I really don't want a tannic wine tonight. Like, I don't want something too mouth drying. Or you can say, I want a dry wine, but you actually like then are taking off dry wines off the table, and maybe you need that for your Asian food, you know, your fusion food. So like, again, just trying to get the lingo and understanding. That's why we taste wine, you know, also obviously for pleasure. But when you're trying to learn the vocabulary, and the first half of the book is all vocabulary, just for that very reason. And not just incidentally like tasting vocabulary, but also winemaking vocabulary, vineyard vocabulary, because that all plays into it too. Wine is essentially farming. So Crozes Hermitage, I think, is a really, you know, delicious wine, very affordable for the Rhone Valley, for the Northern Rhone Valley. You know, the more expensive wines are the Côte Rôties, Hermitage, that are on the hill of, you know, on the hill of Hermitage. There's a great legend about a hermit that after one of the Crusades was just like, I'm out, moved up to the hill of Hermitage, started some vineyards, and then everybody else, and it was named Hermitage because he was a hermit. So kind of an interesting story. Côte Rôtie, the roasted slopes, some of the best wines in the world. And, you know, they are expensive, but they're more affordable than the top Bordeaux. So you've got that going for you, right? If you're interested. Okay. So, and if you do like Crozes Hermitage, I will say this, you have to find good producers and go with them, because those, like I said, they're the ones that grow on the flat areas. You're not going to ever get jammy flavors, but you actually might get very tart flavors. I've had some bad Crozes Hermitage from those tart flavors. So better producers are going to have things that have more flavor. And, you know, in this case, in the Rhone Valley, I am a big advocate of the small producer, but in this case, the negociants and the larger producers, the people who, you know, buy a bunch of grapes, they are great. Delas and Chapoutier and Gugal, these are all big names in this area, and they are fine to buy. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. The best producer, I'll put it in the chat, is largely believed to be Elaine Grayot, who is just makes superb Crozes Hermitage. And that's all he does. He doesn't make, I think he makes maybe another wine from an area called Saint Joseph, also a large area in the Northern Rhone. So fantastic. Any questions on Crozes Hermitage? Let's move over to Columbia Valley and Walla Walla, which is one of my favorite areas. I feel that, okay, I mean, I don't want to overstep here, but sometimes I hear from listeners in Washington that they don't drink their own wines, right? Or they don't find these wines to be like world class. And it boggles my mind, especially because, and the only other place that I hear that is Virginia, right? So Virginia, actually, DC has a really big problem. They don't take in Virginia wines, even though they're great. So Virginia actually sells its wines through the tasting room, and people, like, they even export it to London. More people are interested in London than they are in DC. Strange. But, you know, sometimes people are not as supportive of the trade in Washington, which is disappointing, because this is a world-class area. I mean, what you have here, yes, there have been grapes here grown since the 1860s, although Washington was like the first place to institute prohibition. So I don't know what's up with that, but, you know, thanks a lot, guys. You know, in the 1930s, after prohibition, there was a lot of research done. There was a guy named Dr. Walter Clore at the University of Washington, and he set up a research station in Yakima. And he thought, okay, well, Vitis vinifera can grow in various parts of Yakima. And his experiments really paid off. And oftentimes we see this, that a university will take over and do these experiments. We see Cornell was hugely important in establishing the Finger Lakes. Virginia Tech is starting to be more important. UC Davis, Cal Poly in California, and then all over the University of Geisenheim in Rheingau. I mean, all over the place. So universities are a great breeding ground for helping people develop viticulture programs. But the state's first Syrah was red willow, and it was planted in 1986 in Yakima, and it is still a great wine. So Columbia Valley, what you have all over, right, the southeastern corner of the state is 11 million acres, but only 40,000 planted, and it runs 140 miles. So the Columbia Valley is both a huge appellation, it is very varied, but then when you put it all together, it's smaller than Napa Valley. So, Napa Valley is 45,000 acres just concentrated in one little area. This is spread out over, millions of acres. But the Columbia River and its tributaries are incredibly important. This is similar to the Rhone and other great regions of the world, right? When you have a river, viticulture can help, especially at your latitude. So between 46 and 47 degrees north latitude, again, very similar to Bordeaux, very similar to Rhone. What that means, I think you already know. During the summertime, you get a ton of sun, and you get it for a very short period of time. And already after June 20th, you already start to see some of that decline. And by August, you notice that the days are starting to get shorter, right? I mean, I think, I'm somebody, I live in Raleigh now, but I spent half my life either in Boston, Connecticut, or New York. And living up there, by September, the days were getting shorter, definitely. So if you think about the growing calendar, already in August at your latitude, you're starting to lose some sunlight. And actually, if you look at the sunlight hours, you have more sunlight during the growing season than California, but then it starts to drop off. Intense sun during ripening, and then towards the end of the growing season, you get a little bit of less sun. That's great, because when you're harvesting grapes, you don't want sunburn, right? You don't want too much, although that can still happen. And those cooler nights are going to help give it a punch of acidity right before you pick, which is also fantastic. So that is going to mean that the wines, those diurnals, those temperature diurnals, the day-night temperature swings, and the fact that you do get some of those shorter days right before harvest, that's going to make a big difference. So you get the really strong sun right at the height of the growing season when you're trying to get these grapes to go through what's called veraison, where they get color. And then after that, things start to slow down. It's a perfect mix. And I think Columbia Valley, because it has so much sunshine at the right times, makes a lot of sense. That rain shadow, obviously, Eastern Washington, I don't need to tell you this, it's a desert. The Missoula floods. If you go to Walla Walla and visit, that is all they're going to talk about. You should watch that documentary. I watched it right after I went to Walla Walla. I watched this. There's a National Geographic documentary. It's like an hour long. I was obsessed with it. Everybody will tell you about it. It's on YouTube. It's fantastic. But it talks about how, the glacier near Missoula broke around 400,000 times or something like that, kept little by little dripping, but it was like all of the water in every river in the world. It was with that force every single time there was a fissure. So as you drive through, Eastern Washington, you can see the striations from the Missoula flood. You can see all of that, what happened over the course of geological time. And the valley has been formed by that. And because of that, the uniqueness of the wines it's unrivaled, right? You can't find it anywhere else. That is going to matter. The river is going to matter. And in Walla Walla, that bowl, right? It's a little cooler. You have more rain than other parts, like than Yakima. Walla Walla has a lot more rain, and that, viticulturally speaking, right? They may not notice it, but it's greener, right? When you drive into Walla Walla, it's this amazing bowl. They don't have as many problems with irrigation. They don't have as many problems with sunburn as you're going to get sometimes in Yakima, Red Mountain, and those appellations are going to be very, very hot. Walla Walla has a little bit more of a tempered climate, and there's also hills everywhere are always going to make a big difference. So let's look at our wine. Should be a little bit darker, probably, just because of that pop of sun, right in that in the growing season. You get a little bit more sun, a little bit more color in these wines. Give it a swirl. Look at the legs. Likely a little bit more alcohol. It is warmer here. Take a sniff. Nice. Mine has nice licorice flavors. I have the Lacole, and it's got really licorice notes and nice plum, a little bit of earth, right? You rarely, out of a California Syrah, you rarely get earth, but out of Columbia Valley and Walla Walla, you get it a lot. So that tannic bite should still be there. There should still be great acidity, but a little bit softer, a little fruitier, and maybe just a little bit more evident oak aging. So, the vanilla smoke, toast, whatever. And that's just a real cultural difference in how we use oak in the new world versus how the old world uses oak. Oak is not looked on as something that should or would add flavor. It's something to stabilize the tannins in the wine, the color, and to aid in micro-oxygenation, which will add to the kind of flavor and texture of the wine. Here we really like to burn the barrels, that medium plus toast. You see an M plus every time you go to a winery. We're looking at it as, and winemakers will call it their spice rack. So it's just a difference in philosophy. Katie's finding the Washington Syrah fuller and more fruit forward. Yep, absolutely. So that is the one I'm talking about. Absolutely fruitier, fuller, softer, a little bit softer, more cheek coating. The other wine maybe a bit more suited to food and less of something that you're just going to drink by itself. Brad, you're going to have to chime in here. You're our test kitchen.
Yeah, I actually was going to say, I think that it's an interesting example of old world and new world, in that the Washington wine has a bit more oak. It's a bit fuller. It's a bit richer, almost something that feels like a glass in and of itself. Whereas the Gros Hermitage feels like it wants a bit of food. It's a bit lighter and a bit less alcoholic. And this is, I think, such an interesting example of like all of what makes wine tasting and sort of the world of wine so fun. And you have such an amazing knowledge, as I think you've had the chance to sort of share here around sort of the deep geographies and how you can take something that is sort of so simple, and people might have had a French Syrah and a Washington Syrah and never really thought in a comparative way how different they are, even though they share so much commonality. So it's a really fun format to do it in.
Yeah, I mean, they have similarities in the sense that clearly, I think it's obvious they're the same grape, but the expression is so very, very different. And part of the expression, a couple of years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the organization, the International Organization of Viticulture of Vines, or the OIV, which is the European body that regulates vines. Of course, we don't have that here. Don't get me started on US law. They decided that the definition of terroir was not just the soil and the slope and the way that the slope faces and the steepness and the climate. It wasn't just that. It was also the hand of man, the idea of tradition, how we do things, because that can also influence the wine. What you choose to do, what you choose not to do is going to make a difference. So I think we have two areas, and I like the comparison between these, because although the Gros Hermitage is lighter, and it's certainly, this is affected by a lot of different climatic influences, we're talking about things that are at the same latitude. It's a little bit harder when you're talking about like a wine from Santa Barbara, like a Syrah from Santa Barbara, or even Sonoma. We're talking about similar latitudes and what we do. And we can question, is it the hand of man? Is it the ripening techniques? Is it the terroir? We don't know. And I think that that's really a very interesting thing. Dylan
Elizabeth, so I have a question. Dylan,
Yeah.
this is a little bit of Dylan's question that he
Yeah.
just posted in the chat, which is, so if you were opening these wines, how far in advance would you recommend opening them? And then how would you think about decanting sort of New World wines or Old World wines? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that for these, I decanting is such a difficult topic because I do think it's highly personal. And I think that people give a prescriptive thing on decanting, and I don't think that's right, because I think that we all have different like tastes, right? Some people like a wine a little tighter, a little more tannic. Some people really want all that tannin to kind of dissolve into whatever it is. So I would say, I mean, generally speaking, 30 minutes would be my Syrah happy place, but that's for me, right? I like to have a little bit of tannin in there. I don't want it to go flat. I don't want too much air in there. But, the other thing is people become very obsessed with the object of the decanter. And this is probably a better decanter than the object of the decanter. But when you're decanting a wine, you need to taste it like every 10 minutes. And then you see if it's tasting good to you or it's not tasting good to you. Now, if it's a crappy wine, it will never taste good to you. And that's a shame. But most of the time, there'll be a point where you'll be like, that tastes good. And that's where you should have it, not where like a magazine or a person or even a winemaker tells you how long to decant stuff for. Like, does a sommelier know how much you like your wine decant? I don't think so. So I think, this is all part of, I think, what I try to instill in the podcast and the book is that this wine is personal. Like there's some stuff that's just factual and just is what it is. But your taste is personal. Do not let people dictate to you how this should go. Like it has to be decant or it has to be aged for maybe you like it younger. I mean, or older, who cares? Rheinvan, that's a nice wine. The second label, Result of a Crush. It is not in the rocks. It's not made in the rocks, but I think it's just from like the general Walla Walla appellation. I remember when they were launching that. I think it was like right before I was there. And it's the daughter's project actually, not so it's her thing, and it is not in the rocks. Yeah, Walla Walla. It says Walla Walla, right? Yeah, it doesn't, right? So it's the rocks. If you're not familiar with it, is something that is just incredibly distinctive, and it bleeds into Oregon. It is an area that's really based off of special geography, but it resembles in many ways actually the Rhone. So you do get some more of those characteristics in the rocks that you will find in the Rhone. Definitely olive and bacon fat, which is very common, especially in Rhones that are a little bit older, Syrahs that are a little bit older, and an earthiness, just this very kind of land-based flavor in the Syrah that you won't get anywhere else. It is an amazing, amazing area, and it has giant pebbles on it, which is why they call it in the rocks. Any other questions? Did I miss any questions? Nope.
I have another question I'll throw in on aging. So
Yeah.
we found that with a lot of Washington wines, like we'll age them for quite a long time, even though many places would say not to, and that they generally improve and sort of change quite a lot, even over a 10 to 15 year period, even though there's a sense that they have a much shorter drinking window. And so curious sort of what your thoughts are on, for people who cellar wine, sort of the thoughts on drinking wines sort of earlier in their cycle, and then versus buying wines to sort of cellar and drink, 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
So there are factors involved in aging, and those are, sometimes it's joker's wild, right? Sometimes you're not exactly sure if a wine is going to age. However, there are certain things that are basically like, I think of it as like embalming the wine. So if it is a wine that has high acidity, I think acidity is I think it's the best preservative, honestly. Every wine that is long aged has good acidity. I think that's the number one factor, because if you look at the oldest lived wines, they are wines like even Madeira, right? Port, incredibly high acidity. Riesling, very high acidity. Chenin Blancs, you can age them for a really long time. Sauterne and Bordeaux. And these wines have incredibly high acidity. Northern Rhone as well, high acidity. Nebbiolo, high acidity. So the second layer on top of that, so we already know that there are wines that I just mentioned that have no tannin, right? Riesling has no tannin. Chenin has no tannin. A Sauterne, a blend of, Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc has no tannin. So acidity is a very, very strong indicator that a wine is ripe for aging. The second thing is, if it's a red, does it have tannin? The tannin can be a huge help. Now, tannin recombines in the bottle. Acidity doesn't really change, but tannins will recombine in the bottle. They'll change those chemical, compounds. That's what some of that sediment is settling out. So with time, if the tannins are very coarse at the beginning, they can mature and change over time and settle out to the bottom. So that could be a really good factor also. So tannin and acid together. If you have high tannin and low acid, it's not going to work. Acidity is just key. And then sweetness is the other factor. Sugar is also an embalmer. However, again, I would point out that no sweet wine without acidity is ever going to age. So those kinds of wines are good candidates. I would point out again that although we know traditionally which wines will age because of these factors, it's not to say that you couldn't age another wine. Like if you are finding that you're tasting a Washington wine, you go to Walla Walla and you're like, wow, that is really rough right now, but I think if I kept this for 5-10 years, it would be good. You should do it. And likely it is going to get better. The ones that are you really should not age are the ones that are fruity and smooth and don't have those structural elements, because as soon as you're missing that, you're done, right? Like that's why those cheapy wines won't do. And by the way, there's a lot of hot weather wines that are quite expensive that also they say they'll age and they won't age. They'll become a mouthful of flab, which is the opposite of what you want, right? Some more comments. Third, Katie's about to try WT Vintner's Syrah, Woodinville, recommended. All right, you'll have to let us know how that is. Deidre prefers the Tinte Cellars 2017 to the Hermitage, seems to be richer, right? So if you're used to drinking fuller wines, then you will like the Washington wine better. I think that it's as I always say about the 1976 Paris tasting where they pitted, Napa Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon against French wines. French wines need food. So it's kind of an unfair comparison unless you have like a little bit of cheese. And when I say food, I'm not talking about a huge meal, right? Just a little bit of cheese is going to change the nature of your Crozes Hermitage to something completely different. Dylan says the Crozes Hermitage seemed more complex when he first tried it, and now it is the other way around. So yep, and maybe in another 15 minutes it could turn again, right? So Syrah has that characteristic of being a bit of a chameleon, but it's going to depend on the wine, and also it could also depend on your taste, because you've also now had a richer wine and now you're going back to the Crozes Hermitage that may have kind of made it seem thinner or made it seem less complex. Jeff, given your sort of criteria for things that are safe to age, is there any reason you wouldn't age a wine instead? I'm not quite sure what that means. Anybody? All right, Dylan, when we were in Southern Rhone, the guide we had carried a block of Comte around, right, and said the wines were not right. And I think that I do think that that's true. I think that that's another big cultural difference between French wines and especially Italian wines. Italian wines do not show well without food, in my opinion, and that's because when even the mentality, the thought process of when they are crafting wines is so different. The attitude of a Barolo or Barbaresco producer in Italy, or somebody in Chianti or Montalcino, or somebody in the Rhone or Alsace, they are thinking about food while they're making the wine, right? They're thinking, will this go with the food? And actually, every interview I have ever done, and my show is mostly not interviews, but every interview I have ever done with anybody from Europe, they always talk about food, always. And that is not always the case with, people from other parts of the world. So the mentality is that these wines, you don't drink wine by itself. You have to have something with it. And if you go, if you go to Italy, everybody just they'll just shove food in your face as you're tasting the wine. There's just platters of food coming out. So you never have it alone. Jeff, okay, instead of laying something down and aging, are there reasons to just open and drink a bottle? Sure. I mean, I think for pleasure, right? For something that you really like, that you've tried recently and you want to have. And wines that, I think that you can't take it with you, right? So we have our wines, but you remember your wine is there unless you're investing and trying to sell it. Your wine is for pleasure. It is for drinking. So don't wait too long. And there's always, I find, and again, this is just me, I hate drinking really nice wine on special occasions. I actually always drink it on like a Tuesday night because there's no pressure on the wine at all, right? There's no pressure. There's no the wine is the occasion. You can just concentrate on how good it is. And for those other bottles, I'd like to have any of those on one of the other 6 nights of the week that I drink, because I do drink every night. So, I think my perspective is it is great to cellar wines and lay them down. I have a 50 bottle wine fridge. I have it filled. Those are all the wines that I am aging because they're good vintages. They have the things that I want in them and I want to try them later on. And I add to it, as I deplete it. But I also have, see that giant big refrigerator back there? That's like a 166 bottle fridge. And that's all for just drinking now. Some of them I'll wait after they get shipped to me, but it's all for drink. And actually I have another wine fridge right here. So yeah, I think it's really good to understand that, pleasure. Wine is for live in the present, right? Little bit in the future, plan a little bit for the future.
Elizabeth, one thing I found after reading your book that was inspirational was that you have such a great focus on geography that you're then able to sort of do things like this, like exploring, okay, in Bordeaux, left versus right bank or whatever it might be. So I'm curious for many people on the call who might drink a lot more Washington wines than maybe drinking wines from other areas, if as an extension of this tasting, if you were to have areas that you think would be fun for people to try and explore, either as sort of a next step or to compare and contrast some of the things that you've outlined today.
Yeah, Washington has so much. The reason that I love Washington is because there's a lot of breadth, right? It's not a one-trick pony. We have a lot of sometimes you go to a wine region and it's like one thing. And sometimes that's fantastic, right? If you're in Burgundy, who's going to complain that you just have Pinot Noir and Chardonnay? No one's going to complain about that. But sometimes, it can be a little mundane. But the great thing about Washington is there are red blends and there are Cabernet Sauvignons that stand alone. I think one of the best grapes that Washington grows besides Syrah is Merlot. And it's highly overlooked and it's something that people should try. So for instance, if you're like me and think Washington Merlot kicks butt, then you should be trying things from the right bank as a reference grape, right? That's the original. That's where we started. We started there at Saint-Emilion or Pomerol, or if you want to drink for a little bit less money, Côte de Bordeaux, the best value that there possibly could be maybe in the whole wine world right now. Those wines are really great. But again, if you're finding that the Crozes Hermitage is thin, these wines are going to seem they're going to seem lighter because we don't have the kind of weather conditions and we also don't have the kind of styles there that you're going to have. So you've got to, change your expectation if you don't drink a lot of that. Merlot is really not made very well in many places. So I can't give you a lot of other reference places except the right bank and Washington. I have never done a class. So I do Syrah around the world. I teach Riesling around the world. I teach Pinot Noir around the world, Cabernet around. I cannot do Merlot around the world. There are only 2 places I think do Merlot successfully. You live in one of them and the other one is in Bordeaux. And that's it, right? So done with that. That's easy. So there we go. You also, there are also some really beautiful whites. So There are some Viogniers and Semillons that are made, and Rieslings that are made in, Walla Walla is doing some really interesting things, but Riesling has been a grape traditionally that's grown in Washington very successfully. And I would very much encourage you to look at Finger Lakes and look at Alsace, France, right? Alsace is a big boy Riesling, very soft. And then Germany, despite what people think, is not all sweet wines. In fact, most of the wines that they make are dry. You have to look for this word on the label. Trocken is what we're looking for on the label. Or you need to look for alcohol levels that are higher than 11%, because that will indicate that they have fermented it dry. So, I mean, those kinds of things are really important. Also, Australia, how could I forget Australian Riesling? Clare Valley, Eden Valley, really interesting examples if you like Riesling. And, Syrah, you should try an Australian Shiraz and see how it is. You should try a cooler climate Syrah from New Zealand if you can get your hands on it. Chile is also making some amazing, amazing cool climate Syrah, especially from Casablanca Valley. So, and it's so cheap, it's absurd. So, those kinds of things really are great to try. Just, look around. Cabernet Sauvignon, definitely, again, Chile, look outside of the United States and you're going to find a lot of very interesting things that are out there to be had. And some of them, it's not much of a risk to try them, because a Chilean wine for $20 is going to drink like a $50 bottle of US wine. So that's great. But, again, Australia, especially some of the areas in Victoria, the cooler climate, you want to start looking at, some of the cooler climate places. That way you'll get more terroir expression. Hot places, oftentimes it's just a bunch of grape, and you might like that, but it might be too much.
All right. Well, it's a little after 6 now, so I think we should wrap up. This has been so great. Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for everybody for your attention.
And thank you everyone who joined us to taste and shared what you were experiencing and what you were drinking. We have recorded this talk and it will be on our YouTube channel within the next 48 hours or so, just Book Larder YouTube channel. If you are interested in natural wine, a couple weeks ago, we actually did a chat with Renee Erickson and the guys who have Noble Rot in London and just wrote a book all about wine that they like. So it's another really great book that actually would make a really great kind of complement to Elizabeth's book. Thank you so much, Brad and Raven and Russ, for getting all of us together. It was so much fun. And we'll put links to Phenol55 in the notes with the YouTube as well, so that you can find that if you're interested in learning more. Thank you, everyone. Elizabeth, congratulations on the book. Thank you for
Thanks so
joining
much.
us.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much. That was so great.
Have a great night.
Enjoy the sunshine, everyone. Bye.
Bye.